Hey, Cypher here. 2023 was a great year for historical movies, not just because of the Barbenheimer craze, but Killers of the Flower Moon is an instant classic. We didn't get many at the box office, but those two were absolute greats. Think Cleo Napoleon flopped, but I'll cover that soon enough. Instead, I want to talk about the second great historical movie to come out last year. It's a sad and difficult topic that they managed to handle with grace. Arguably better than the book it's based on did, which I did a review of for that in the book club format a while ago. The Osage Murders, or the Terror as the tribe calls it, was an atrocious series of events that have yet to be fully covered and may never be. But I can at least explain the general context of why more than 50 Osages were likely murdered for oil money over the course of just a few years in the 1920s. Thanks to my patrons for making this possible. My last two episodes have been demonetized by Team YouTube, which is quite the blow, since that is an entire month of income down the drain. I knew the Armenian Genocide episode was doomed, since Team YouTube specifically changed their monetization policy to discourage historians from speaking on such topics. Yes, Team YouTube supports genocide denial. Their policy is in response to my having pointed that out a few years ago, when I even managed to get the hashtag TrustBustGoogle trending on Twitter just as they faced a monopoly lawsuit. I did that purposefully. They had created a task force in response to that video, and I was a direct part, but it was actually just to get us to shut up, and it worked. I couldn't get the other members of that team to speak out publicly when Team YouTube ghosted us. Hence why I normally have to avoid the topic of genocide. What I didn't expect was that Team YouTube demonetized my Moral Panics episode for adult content. I kid you not, a so-called human review considers LGBT people's mere existence to be adult content. There is absolutely no nudity or discussion of sex whatsoever. So the only conclusion is that they've concurred with homophobes and transphobes everywhere in trying to suppress the visibility of these marginalized identities. Just look at that statement. Go back and watch that episode. These two things cannot go together without clear transphobia and homophobia. Team YouTube's bigotry knows no end. Indeed, we really need to trust bust this platform's owner, Google. It'd be pretty funny to get that trending again. Since obviously this platform's managers despise educational content, thank you to my Patreon supporters and those who buy merchandise like these stickers. It goes a long way to supporting my continuing public history work. The Osage tribe had signed several treaties with the United States throughout the 19th century that moved them farther and further west into what is now Kansas. But squatters regularly caused trouble, especially during the fighting over slavery before and during the Civil War. After all that, they signed the Drum Creek Treaty, selling their Kansas lands to buy Cherokee land in Indian Territory, which is now called Oklahoma. This meant that they had special sovereignty over the mineral rights there. But no one really cared at first, since it was mostly marginal prairie. Despite their overwhelming loyalty to US federal authorities throughout this time, Congress failed to budget enough money for their treaty-guaranteed provisions, leading to famine. Once relegated to a corner of Indian Territory, America simply neglected Osages, so they created their own constitution in 1881, beginning the Osage National Council. For 3 decades, they remained self-sufficient and unencumbered because of this decision. But oil was found on Osage land in 1894. It took years for that to develop, but Americans were keen on doing so. Congress tried to allot their land, but couldn't get much done until 1906, reorganizing the council as a result and initiating large-scale oil production. Since Osage Nation remained owners of most of this oil-rich territory, each adult member of the tribe had an equal share of oil profits, called head rights, and the tribe made a fortune. By the mid-1920s, they were the richest people per capita in the world. In 1923, one reporter said, "The Osage Indians are becoming so rich that something will have to be done about it." There were a number of ways for non-Osages to access head rights. One way was to inherit it through familial affiliation. Another was to have a member declared incompetent and become their guardian, holding their fortune in trust. Finally, Americans overcharged Osages, and with the limitations of guardianship, many Osages became indebted, siphoning off more oil money. As a result of outsiders trying to access head rights, numerous Osages died under mysterious circumstances beginning as early as 1918. Many were clearly slayings, but others were likely poisonings or undetermined. Since so much local governance was corrupted by this system, it is nearly impossible to tell what was a murder. Furthermore, as with any mineral rush, crime became rampant during the 1920s in Oklahoma. In addition to that, the influx of people may have caused a significant amount of disease to spread. Estimating how many Osage deaths were from foul play during this period is impossible. It could be as low as the 24 that the FBI found for sure, but it could be more than 100. At first, locals followed regular avenues of coroner juries and sheriff investigations, but as cases piled up, they sought outside help. First, the tribe hired private detectives, but by 1921, the Bureau of Investigation, later renamed FBI, eventually showed up. The bumbling failure of this early investigation led to an informant killing a cop. When Agent Tom White assembled a secret team, they uncovered a scheme where the so-called King of the Osage Hills, William Hale, had knocked off several Osages to concentrate head rights in a family he controlled. His Osage victims were Henry Roan, Anna Brown, Bill and Rita Smith, alongside their maid Nettie Brookshire, Lizzie Q. Kyle, and Minnie Smith, leaving only Molly Burkhart left of the four sisters and mother. She was married to one of the accomplices and quickly left the Burkhart name behind. Hale also bumped off two of his accomplices before getting caught. Through savvy judicial maneuvering, the FBI obtained several convictions in 1926, but most cases went unsolved. Congress stepped in before that. All American Indians were granted citizenship in 1924, and a year later, they made it illegal for non-Osages to inherit head rights. Nonetheless, some killings continued until at least 1931. The Reign of Terror embitters the memory of their oil boom for Osages today. While the story was extremely sensational at the time, once it faded from the headlines, almost no one cared to dig into the cases left open. The tribe mostly tried to live it all down. The FBI repeatedly told the story of their successful investigation, but always left out their failure before White and crew showed up. They even put it in a self-aggrandizing movie called The FBI Story in 1959. In that, the only person named was J. Edgar Hoover, who plays himself as the leader of the FBI. White told his story to Verdon Adams, who posthumously published a biography of him. Largely, that's all the public knew of the Osage Murders. Sometimes newspapers would reiterate the FBI story, but largely it went forgotten. Author David Gran went digging into it for his second book. He uncovered the failed investigation and published an account in 2014. That is what the movie is based on. But the book had some significant deficiencies. I did a whole live stream reviewing it, and you can see a more detailed criticism there. The main problems were because Gran is a trained journalist, and so did not include sufficient analysis that would have helped further scholarly research. The last section of the book is just him talking about himself going to Osage Nation, and there's not really any agency given to Osages themselves. Also, it straight up doesn't understand how the justice system worked back then, and that bugged me way more than it should. But luckily, Martin Scorsese, the director, in conjunction with Leonardo DiCaprio, the lead actor, took the movie in a different direction. Originally, they were simply going to follow the book and tell the story of White, but they decided to center Molly's story instead, which turned out to be a great decision. Scorsese's best work depicts crime from the criminal's perspective, so viewing it through the victim's eyes is unique. The actress who portrays Molly, Lily Gladstone, did a hell of a job, and honestly, she deserved the Oscar.
Lily, I share this with you. I'm in awe of you.
I genuinely think this movie managed to move past the problems of the book, delivering a masterpiece that I hope will inspire further research into the Osage Murders. We get a real good sense of the time and how whites exploited Osages during the oil rush.
Here, I know. Money flows freely here now. Well, I do.
Even though tribe members were the richest people per capita on Earth at the time, we see why they truly did not hold that wealth.
It's your mother. You know, she's restricted too, so we have to account for every penny. And I can't let you have this money or make this trip.
The entire conspiracy to gain head rights is shown in great detail.
With these women dying, with how Osage suffered from illness, you have to make it the head rights come to you.
The murders are shown as best as we know. The investigation and trial are also quite accurate.
And who asked you to do all this?
My uncle, William Hale.
Can you see him?
The essentials are all there, and the film goes further than that. The movie insightfully illustrates the way this terror affected Osages.
Knights come marching in, that's it, Fitz.
Hey, Ernest.
For instance, they have a belief that owls are a memento mori, which sure enough, it comes for a few in the movie. I really like the bit where Burkhart is yelling at Molly that she's too superstitious to take her medicine.
Well, you think you can get better with all them medicine, man, and all them roots and all them herbs and all that? That's real medicine.
Yet he was unwittingly poisoning her. That speaks to such a deep sympathy for Osage's plight without the need to believe their religion. Molly's assigned guardian is shown to be a Klansman, which is depicted as a large and public institution, which is quite accurate for the time. The second Ku Klux Klan had just formed in 1915 and was at the height of its membership in the early 1920s. It's quite feasible that her guardian was one in real life and engaged in a larger conspiracy to defraud her through other KKK members. The tribe even gets some necessary contextualization at the beginning. Scorsese's decision to shift the focus to Molly enabled this, and it paid off well, leading this movie to a great deal of depth with such a painful topic. That also allows Scorsese to take a victory lap at the end, making this true crime radio show that's reminiscent of the way J. Edgar Hoover capitalized on the fame of uncovering this conspiracy. This is how he can bring the history forward into the present, including him stepping in front of the camera to read Molly's obituary, and it loops back around with a current-day Osage ceremony. It's incredibly edifying and shows that history is best depicted with sympathetic and thoughtful narratives. Heck, they managed to hint at the innumerable unsolved murders and why they went unsolved in a far more effective way than a journalist prattling on about some lost city of Zed, a forgotten past. And while it is very accurate, there are a few things that I should point out. There's only some really minor falsehoods, and they're all done in the service of elevating the Osage tribe's voice after decades of erasure. For instance, they talk about past wrongs using words like genocide, where that was not a term until 1943.
But we've also got to realize it's evil that's come here. Yeah. You have something it wants. Yeah. It didn't want you when we was coming through genocides out coming home.
This is essentially American Indian movement talking points from the 1970s, which weren't available to people in 1922, but that allows Osages today to talk through the movie, even if it's anachronistic. Another inaccuracy happens when they have Molly go directly to President Coolidge to ask for detectives to solve these murders. That didn't happen. Though there were some Osage women as part of a delegation who did talk to Coolidge, Molly just wasn't one of them. And finally, there's this time that the tribal council expresses anger with how slow the investigation is happening.
We have so many deaths we've lost count. We have hundreds down.
In the old days, we would fight these people.
They would have been more angry about the previously failed investigations, which the movie doesn't depict for brevity's sake. But both of these don't affect the narrative. It's simply a bit of fictionalization there to give victims a little more agency. A different fictionalization is when Hale paddles Burkhart at a Masonic lodge to keep him disciplined and avoid leaking the conspiracy to authorities.
She got the tribal council to pay for Barney McBride's trip to Washington. You got to take back control of your home.
While Hale was a Freemason, Burkhart likely wasn't. There's also no secret paddling room in a Masonic lodge. This is pure fiction, but that's actually DiCaprio getting a paddle broken on his butt, though it was cushioned. It's just a silly scene that reveals Hale's inner cruelty. It's also cool that they managed to fit the fable of vanishing Indians into this, which I've talked about in the Wild West myth episode, but it is basically the falsehood that American Indians were doomed to die out, and that somehow justified their dispossession.
I love them, but in the turning of the earth, they're gonna go.
The truth revealed by this fictionalization is that the frontier myth was at the root of Hale's mindset and innumerable others. The myth is what validated their violence, along with all the rest of Manifest Destiny's ruthlessness. Then there's this scene.
Bill Burns, I solve crimes. This is my card.
What? William Burns did have a private detective agency, but at the time depicted, he was the director of the Bureau of Investigation. A communist rag called him King of Dicks. Obviously, that refers to him leading the Federal Detective Agency, so YouTube, don't demonetize this one, please. Burns was integral to getting the BOI to dig into the Osage Murders. He was a terrible director and tried to cover up the Teapot Dome scandal by intimidating newspapers with fraudulent investigations and blackmail. Because of that, he had to step down in 1924, which is when J. Edgar Hoover took over as director. While Hoover did try to professionalize the FBI, he would adopt many of Burns's tactics to suppress domestic dissent. Hoover was simply conniving enough to not get caught before fully establishing his power. I don't know why Scorsese turned Burns into a private detective, but that seems like a mistake. Finally, the scene where Hale and Burkhart are arguing in the jail never happened. They were kept separate during the trials. This is a necessary fictionalization in order to heighten the enormity of Burkhart changing his tune and show a deeper love he probably held for Molly and their children. That balance between sympathy and the fact that he participated in such a monstrous conspiracy is incredibly difficult, but Scorsese nailed it. As you can see, this movie was great, a real masterpiece. Scorsese knocked it out of the park, and I hope to see more like it. During the... Meow. What? You complain, you get picked up. Now what? He thinks he's going somebody or somewhere, but he's not. You can't. You can't. This is your life. You're stuck here.